I'm still searching for that voice which tells me, darling, I'm going to Charlie.
For me, 7/7, from my experience, is a pain like no other. It will never go away. The effects of that day will never leave me.
They told me back then in 1983 that terrorism was finished, and I said no, it's just started.
Françoise Rudetzki is a victim but also a survivor of terrorism. In 1983, she was severely injured when a bomb exploded right outside the restaurant in Paris where she and her husband were eating. It would be the day her fight began. A fight not to have her leg amputated, a fight to prove the explosion was a terrorist act, but especially a fight to guarantee full rights for victims of terrorism.
The first fight was in &86 with the creation of a solidarity fund, which is the only one of its kind in the world. It fully compensates victims of terrorism. And the second battle took 4 years, when in 1990 a law was passed regarding the status of civil victims of war in that terrorism was officially recognized as a new form of war.
Rudetzki has been helping these victims of a new type of war ever since the Solidarity Fund was created. Her latest battle, making sure the survivors and victims' families of France's latest attacks understand their full rights.
We have this fund which is supported by a national solidarity in that everyone in France pays a small sum of €4.30 as of the 1st of January 2016, which is withdrawn from your insurance contract. So we have the necessary means. And we have what we call integral compensation, which means that everything is taken care of or paid for, be it the physical injuries and their consequences, the psychological consequences, and also help in training for those who've lost their jobs. It's true that sometimes there are difficulties since the victims have to undergo what we call medical expertises to evaluate the extent of their damage. And it's true that sometimes the experts have a tendency, once the initial emotional moment has passed, to minimize the physical and emotional scars.
Coming to terms with emotional scars. This is what Maryse Wolinski, whose husband was killed a year ago in the Charlie Hebdo attack, has done through writing a book. She says learning to live without her husband of almost 50 years has been difficult and painful. And although she's grateful for the Solidarity Fund, she says compensation has been slow in coming.
I find that there were a lot of promises made that were not kept. For example, the Solidarity Guarantee Fund starts by telling you that they will give you a provision. So there is a small provision, and then the necessary to help you maintain the main standard of living that you had with your husband. But it's been 1 year now, and it's extremely complicated. They are waiting to see how my husband's books have been sold since the attack, because they could then reduce that from my compensation. But this has nothing to do with that.
Daniel Biddle survived the London terrorist bombings on the 7th of July 2005, which killed 52 people and injured hundreds. He was just feet away from one of the suicide bombers who blew himself up in the London Underground. For Daniel, not only was the attack beyond surreal, but a compensation process very different from other countries was also surreal. In the UK, terrorist attacks are treated as a crime.
It's one of those situations where you're trying to come to terms with the impact of what's happened, you're trying to come to terms with your disability, you're trying to come to terms with your new body shape, and everything's different. And then you're handed a book, basically like an Argos catalogue, like a shopping catalogue, and it just basically lists injuries, body parts that are missing, and you just have to go through the book, tick in what body parts are worth the most amount of money. For me, what was incredibly distressful was the fact that I had a lot of injuries. I mean, I had over 100 injuries to my body. But through our compensation system in the UK, you can only claim for 3 injuries. Once you've made that claim, they then deduct money off of each injury. So I got the £110,000 for losing my legs. They then deducted 70% of the value of losing an eye, and then they deducted 85% of the value of losing my spleen. So they've effectively penalised you for being injured and having more than one injury in an event that is totally out of your control.
Coming to terms with being part of an event that is out of your control, but also the process of bereavement, of pain and of anger is something Biddle knows all too well when asked his reaction to the November 13th Paris attacks.
Being a survivor of a terrorist attack myself, I know what those families are going to have to go through, and I know what the survivors of that attack, what they're going to be facing in the months and years coming, and it is incredibly difficult. And that the one thing I learned very quickly from my own experience is your physical injuries heal up pretty quickly, the scars are there, but the mental scars, they stay for ages.
For Wolinski, the emotional scars are still raw, and she still has questions as to how the Charlie Hebdo attacks ever happened. For her, writing this book is part of the healing process.
I wrote this book because those words, "Darling, I'm going to Charlie," were with me constantly. I couldn't stop hearing them, and I went from there. Because you hear that phrase and then after, nothing. How was it that an attack could take place in the offices of a satirical newspaper, which was already a known target for the police? But there was no surveillance, and I started writing what you could call an investigation. I think that this book, which I wrote during last summer, has been the beginning of a reconstruction.
Rebuilding one's life after the terror. For Daniel, the turning point was meeting his wife Jem 2 years ago, but also going back to work. He created a consulting company which gives advice on disability access.
Disability, for me, was the worst thing that I could have ever imagined, and I never thought I'd be in the situation that I'm in now. And it took me a long time to realise that life isn't over. It's just the start of a new chapter. I'm fortunate enough that I got a second chance at life, and I'm very fortunate that I got a second chance at happiness. So a lot of the driving force behind what I and my company do is basically saying to people that, yeah, terrible things happen, and it takes a long time to deal with it, but there is a way through. And if we can make that journey a little bit easier by making it possible for you to go to a restaurant, a hotel, get away for a weekend, just do something that is what you would deem normal from the life you used to lead, if we can be part of that process to make that possible, then that's got to be a good thing.
For 30 years, the Solidarity Fund Françoise Rudetzki helped set up has compensated more than 4,200 victims, both in France and overseas. But for her, the most important accomplishment is not the numbers, but the people behind them.
For me, there shouldn't be a difference between the victims of Charlie Hebdo, famous victims, journalists or others who are in show business. For me, all the victims should be treated equally, whether they're homeless or known. And that's what I'm most proud of.